Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise in support, as my honourable friend from Llanelli has said, of the motion. And whilst this is a motion that many might have expected in itself was limited in scope and was likely to be passed without much comment, the Minister, who I have to say I'm a big admirer of in the job that he does, has broadened the scope of the motion, and I think other members have taken him up on the challenge that he posed. And I think that his speech was a remarkable one. I can't think of many times where a minister has stood at the dispatch box and been so implicitly critical of the government that he is speaking on behalf of. And I support entirely his call for greater investment in our armed forces, and I will expand upon some of the arguments that he made about our investment in equipment. I'll, of course, allow him to.
I wouldn't want the Honourable Gentleman to mislead the House to say that I was somehow not supportive of the government. I'm absolutely, of course, supportive of the government, loyal government minister. I'm simply encouraging advancement of policy. I think that's where our identical.
Well, people will read the Honourable Gentleman's speech and make their own minds up as to whether he was urging the government to take action in a different direction. But if he's wanting advancement of policy, he seems to be in exactly the right place to do it as a minister for the as a defence minister. But I think he's absolutely right to say that whilst we absolutely recognise the professionalism of those people who serve and the admiration that he has, that I have, and I know right across the House that we have for people who dedicate their lives to our armed forces. We also have to ask ourselves some very serious questions about the way in which we support them, and I'll come to those in a moment. Now, if I was to have an area of disagreement with him, it was on his question, or on his kind of challenge to the public about the fact that we need to have an honest conversation with the public. It doesn't seem to me that it's the public that's preventing the government from spending more on our armed forces or from meeting greater than the 2% commitment on spending. We've had a debate here in this House that I remember his honourable friend from New Forest leading about having greater spending. There was widespread agreement from across the House that we should have greater spending. I've never had a member of the public say to me on my surgeries or when I'm out door knocking on a Saturday that they disagree with greater spending on the armed forces. So it doesn't seem to me that he needs the public, he needs to convince we need to spend more on the armed forces. It's in fact his right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister that need to be persuaded that we need to spend more money on our armed forces. And he spoke about his commitment to the armed forces community and his disappointment that there is such low morale on pay and pensions, and he introduced the issue of accommodation as another real bone of contention. I support him entirely on tackling those issues. And I think that in terms of what he said, and the honourable member from Torbay was talking about, in terms of the fact that we shouldn't just see being a member of the armed forces as similar to any other job, I agree with that. Of course, there is a level of commitment that is required from members of the armed forces that isn't the same as other jobs, but that doesn't let the government off the hook when it comes to pay and pensions, when it comes to treating people who serve with the due respect that they have the right to expect. When it comes to saying to their loved ones that we actually value your support for those members of the armed forces, pay and pensions, accommodation is one of the ways that we recognise that commitment that they show. So whilst I absolutely recognise it isn't the same as another job, that doesn't let the government off the hook in terms of ensuring that the pay of members of our armed forces keeps pace with inflation, and that they're no worse off at the end of the year than they were at the start of it. I think that is a very basic commitment. But I think another very basic commitment is that we have that investment in the equipment that they use, in the training that they receive, and in the deployments and commitments that we expect of them. And I think there is an area there where we need to pose very serious questions of the government. Now the Minister said that we have the most professional armed forces in the world. But I think we do have to, it's very important we're not complacent in this area. He mentioned previously our main battle tank is 20 years old. When I speak to members of the armed forces, as I've had the privilege of doing as a result of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, they're absolutely wanting me as a member of the armed forces to hold the government to account on our investment in the equipment that they use, and they share many of the same reservations that he has. They also share reservations about the level of experience that some people within our armed forces have. We've had a huge number of people leaving the armed forces who had been through engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, and were absolutely kind of match fit. They know there are people in those roles now who, whilst well trained, are much less experienced than people would have been 8 or 9 years ago in those kind of arenas. And so, in absolutely expressing our admiration for the people in our armed forces, we must never be complacent about what we actually have on the ground. And I had the pleasure of going over to Kenya to visit Batak as a part of the AFPS scheme, and I know there have been training courses cancelled on many occasions in the last year and a half or so, and that is a facility that's been used a lot less than it has previously. And so that investment in the training of members of our armed forces, making sure that they are used to the various different kinds of theatres that they may face, I think is incredibly important. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the point raised by my honourable friend from Llanelli about the Tory manifesto pledge of 82,000, it would be interesting when the Minister winds up whether he can give us absolute clarity on whether that is still a commitment the government considers itself bound to, or whether, because it wasn't featured so explicitly in the 2017 manifesto, it is now more of an aspiration than a commitment. Well, either way, it is a commitment that isn't being met. So I support entirely the motion in front of us, but I do also share many of the concerns that have been raised, and I absolutely pledge my support to the Minister in the campaign that I think he has to persuade his honourable members in the Treasury to give our armed forces the support they absolutely need and deserve.